This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is another installment of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers, from over a century ago. We begin this installment with Chapter 21, Wood's Second Administration, 1856 to 1859. Under Wood's second administration, city affairs went from bad to worse. The departments reeked with frauds. The city paid Robert W. Lauber $196,000 for a lot officially declared to be worth only $60,000, and to two-thirds of which, it was proved, Lauber had no title. Comptroller Flagg charged that both the mayor and the common council were parties to it. Fraudulent computations and illegitimate contracts were covered by false entries. Amounts on the ledger were revised so as to steal considerable sums from the city outright. To Bartlett Smith had been awarded a contract for grading certain streets. Before beginning work, however, the legislature created Central Park out of that very territory. Smith demanded $80,000 from the city, quote, for trouble in arranging to do the grading, unquote, a claim the council allowed, but Flagg refused to pay. It was generally charged that Wood sold the office of street commissioner to the notorious Charles Devlin for $50,000 cash, with certain reservations as to the patronage and profits. Devlin recouped himself, for an investigation revealed that he had spent $500,000 on contracts of which he was either the real contractor or surety, and on which he made the prices 75% higher than they ought to have been. Of how much the city was plundered it was impossible to find out, since no reliable accounts of expenditures were kept in the finance department. Not a few officials, relinquishing offices paying about $2,500 a year, retired loaded with riches and surrounded by friends whom they had enriched. Wood himself was now reputed to be worth $400,000. Even the judiciary was held in general contempt. The Lauber fraud was promptly excused, and the defendant exonerated by the courts. In November 1855, a city judge was tried for corruption in having entered a nolle prosequi in a certain case. The verdict was not guilty, with this remarkable addition, quote, and the jury are unanimously of the opinion that in the entry of the nolle prosequi by the city judge he has been guilty of irregularity, and it is the unanimous recommendation of the jury that the judge resign, unquote. He resigned. In December 1855, during a trial for murder in the Supreme Court, counsel for the defendant exclaimed, quote, I know the jury have too much intelligence to pay any regard to the assumptions of the court, unquote. A man was killed at a prize fight. The coroner, after stating the evidence at the inquest, concluded, quote, if the persons implicated are tried before our Court of Sessions, they will have reason to congratulate themselves, as it is a difficult matter in this city to convict a person charged with any other crime than theft, unquote. In January 1856, the seat of one of the judges of the Supreme Court was contested by two candidates, both claiming to have been elected by popular vote. Both asserted the right to sit. In opposition to the opinions of the judges sitting, one of the contestants took and kept his seat by pure quote-unquote nerve. A new city charter, adopted in 1857, changed the date of municipal elections to the first Tuesday in December, and provided for an election for mayor and common council in December 1857. The change was aimed partly at Wood. He had probably expected severe opposition of some kind, for he had early begun planning for the continued control of the Tammany General Committee so as to secure a renomination. In the primary elections, late in 1856, for delegates to this committee, for 1857, a majority favorable to Wood had been elected, after violence and ballot box stuffing in every ward. The Wood men took possession of the wigwam and elected Wilson Small chairman. The rival party met in another place and organized a general committee. Each put forward the claim of quote-unquote regularity. As the quote-unquote usages of the party required that the quote-unquote regular committee should have legal possession of Tammany Hall, it was necessary to determine which that committee was. Then the sachems stepped in. 7 of them, a majority of 1, were Wood's personal enemies. By a vote of 7 to 5, the sachems concluded to order the election of a new general committee, which was to have all known Democrats enrolled into associations. Said the 7 sachems' report, quote, Tammany Society is the undisputed owner of Tammany Hall, and the right to control the use of that building which is inherent in its ownership has been fully secured by the lease. The council is determined that their action shall vindicate fully the rights and powers of the venerable society of which they are officers, and also prove a safe and efficient barrier against the tide of corruption and fraud which is sapping the power of the great party to which the society has adhered during the whole period of its existence. Unquote. At the society's annual election on May 20th, the Isaac V. Fowler, or Reform ticket, had the names of some men of note: Samuel Tilden, Elijah Purdy, Peter Sweeney, Edward Cooper, William Cornell, John McKeon, Emmanuel Hart, while Wood's candidates were inferior hack politicians and non-entities. The quote-unquote 7 sachems had previously managed to get into the wigwam unobserved by the Wood men, and had rapidly elected nearly 60 new members, all their own partisans. These voted at the election, enabling Wood's opponents to beat him by a majority of 60. Then the 7 sachems turned Wood and his men out of the wigwam. In a public address, the Wood men thereupon declared the society an irresponsible body of less than 400 members, 1/3 of whom held no communication with the Democratic Party, and that of its 13 sachems, 7 were quote-unquote Libby bolters. Quote, "What then is the issue?" unquote, asked the address. Quote, "Shall the sachems rule the people, or shall the people rule themselves? shall the sachems of this close corporation, to procure offices for themselves and friends, be permitted, unrebuked by the people, to exercise this omnipotent, dictatorial, supervisory power over the grand Democratic Party, its organization and interests, to rule out or rule in your general committees whenever it suits their caprice or selfish purposes." Unquote. The control of the police force was considered as necessary as ever to success at the election. The changes of 1853, from which much was hoped, had proved of little benefit. The force was in a chaotic state. Political and pecuniary reasons alone guided the appointment of policemen. No record of merit was kept. There was no systematic instruction of policemen in their duties, except as to drill. Some captains wore uniforms, others refused. When an applicant appointed to the force was tested for qualifications in reading, a large newspaper was given to him, and he was told to read the title. Murder abounded, and the city was full of escaped convicts. One of the most important provisions of a special act of 1857 was the transfer of the police from city control to that of the state. Unwilling to surrender so effective a hold, Wood resisted the legislature's action. For a time there were two police departments, the Metropolitan Force under the state commissioners, and the municipal police under the mayor, each contending for supremacy. One day a part of the two forces came into collision in the city hall, and 12 men were wounded. It was found necessary to summon the militia to quell the disturbances, and Wood was arrested. Finding resistance useless, he submitted grudgingly to the new order. The police being so disorganized, the criminal classes ran the town. Chief among Wood's supporters were the quote-unquote dead rabbits, or quote-unquote blackbirds, a lawless gang who overawed certain portions of the city, and who had a rival in the quote-unquote Bowery Boys, whose sole profession seems to have been to pack primaries, break ballot boxes, and fight the quote-unquote dead rabbits. On July 4th, 1857, the dead rabbits, presumably having nothing else to do, attacked a body of police in Jackson Street. A band of Bowery Boys hurried to the front, and a pitched street battle ensued, pistols and muskets being procured from neighboring places. Barricades were thrown up in the most approved Parisian style. The result was the killing of 10 and the wounding of 80 persons, some of whom were innocent bystanders. This was the most deadly of the numerous collisions of these gangs. As they had a powerful political influence, the police did not molest them. As a member of the Metropolitan Police Commission, Mayor Wood, about this time, was instrumental in giving out a contract for 4,000 glass ballot boxes at $15 apiece. It was disclosed in James Horner's affidavit before Judge Davis in the Supreme Court in November of that year that the city needed no more than 1,200 of the boxes. That Wood's brother had secured the 4,000 boxes at a cost of less than $5 apiece, and that the mayor was to share in the $40,000 of expected profits. Wood neglected no means of ingratiating himself with the masses. The Panic of 1857 suddenly deprived over 80,000 mechanics and laborers in the city of employment. Wood proposed the employment of the idle, on the public works, and the buying by the city of 50,000 barrels of flour and an equal amount of other provisions to be disposed of to the needy at cost. The Common Council failed to see the value of this plan, but did appropriate a sum for public works in Central Park, the better share of which went to contractors and petty politicians. To win the goodwill of the Roman Catholics, becoming more and more of a power, the Common Council gave over to the Roman Catholic Orphan Asylum a perpetual lease of the entire plot from 5th to 4th Avenue, 51st to 52nd Street, at a rental of $1 a year. So resourceful was Wood, and so remarkable his political ingenuity, that though he and his General Committee were driven out by the Tammany Society, he nevertheless brought things about so that the Democratic Convention in Tammany Hall, on October 15th, renominated him for mayor by 75 votes to 12. The Tammany General Committee thereupon openly repudiated him, and the curious complication was presented of a candidate who was the Tammany regular nominee, yet opposed by both the Society and the General Committee. Instantly, a determined citizens' movement to defeat him sprang up. The city taxes had nearly doubled in 3 years of Wood's administration, and were now over $8 million, of which over $5 million had already been signed away in contracts or spent in advance of collection. Yet the Common Council had recently resolved to spend the exorbitant sum of $5 million on a new city hall. The mayor vetoed the resolution only when the most intense public opposition was manifested. A committee of citizens, representative of the Republicans, Democrats, and Native Americans, nominated Daniel F. Timon, a paint dealer and a member of Tammany Hall, but who was an alderman and as governor of the almshouse had made a good record. To Wood's support there concentrated the preponderance of the foreign-born, the native rowdies, and the usual mass blinded into voting for the regular ticket. The gamblers, brothel keepers, immigrant runners, and swindlers of every kind bought and cheated for him in the belief that the reformers would drive them from the city. Wood had taken the precaution to manufacture thousands of voters. From the wigwam, where the Wood partisans backed up their right to meet with fists, drummers up were sent to bring in prospective citizens. Upon promising faithfully to vote the Tammany ticket, a card, valued at 50 cents, was furnished gratuitously to each. It was addressed to a judge who owed his election to Tammany, and read, "Common Pleas. Please naturalize the bearer, N. Segrist, Chairman." From 3,000 to 4,000 voters, it was estimated, were turned out by this process. The sentiment of certain politicians may be taken from John Cochrane's remark that, quote, he would vote for the devil incarnate if nominated by Tammany Hall, unquote. Meanwhile, they took care to make out Wood to be a much-abused man. At the ratification meeting in Tammany Hall on November 23rd, long resolutions were passed, fulsomely flattering Wood and asking voters to remember that if Wood was assailed, so Jefferson, Jackson, and Daniel Webster were pursued to their graves by harpies. the voters were asked not to be deceived by the abuse of the graceless, godless characters and disappointed demagogues. Wood and his partisans strained every nerve for success, but it was a futile effort. The opposition won, Timon receiving 43,216 votes to 40,889 for Wood. His large vote, however, showed the dangerous strength of the worst classes of the city and boded ill for the years to come. The opposition of the Tammany Society and the General Committee having been responsible for his defeat, Wood made renewed efforts to regain sway over both. On their part, elated at his supposed downfall, the anti-Wood members of the General Committee decided to expel Daniel Sickles and C. Godfrey Gunther, two of his supporters, and met for that purpose in the Wigwam on December 9, 1857. Wood's followers thought proper to impress upon the General Committee a sense of their strength. Accordingly, their fighting men were present in full force, awaiting an opportunity to mingle in the proceedings. The probability of a violent row increasing momentarily, the Metropolitan Police were summoned to Tammany Hall. For a time they kept the hostiles within bounds, but the bar was well patronized, and large delegations of the dead rabbits and shoulder hitters from the wards were flowing in constantly. At 9 o'clock a desperate fight was begun in the center of the barroom amid intense excitement. By using their clubs unsparingly, the 40 policemen succeeded in separating the combatants, though not before a young man, Cornelius Woods, had been shot in the shoulder with a slug. Unwilling to draw upon themselves the resentment of the influential ward politicians, the police made no arrests. The meeting broke up without definite action being taken in the matter of expelling the two supporters of Wood. The first and chief point in the struggle for the control of the organization was, as usual, the control of the Tammany Society. Both factions were alive to this necessity. On April 13, 1858, 150 members of the society met at the Westchester House, Bowery, and Broome Streets, where it was announced that 212 members were pledged to vote for anti-Wood sachems. Some of these members were seeking the ascendancy for their own benefit, while others were not politically active at all, but had become disgusted with Wood's methods and men. At the election, 6 days later, the anti-Wood ticket, headed by Isaac Fowler and Nelson Waterbury, won by a majority of nearly 378 members voting. More than 20 members who had not been at an election of the society for 20 years or more, and a large number who had eschewed voting for 10 years, hastened, some from distances, to deposit their votes. 3 came from Hudson, a number from Albany, 2 from Washington, and 1 from Cincinnati. The result was Wood's forced withdrawal from the organization. He immediately started a Democratic organization opposed to Tammany, and upon the same lines. It was known generally as Mozart Hall, from the name of the assembly room in which it met. Wood denounced Tammany declaring that its nominees were chosen by 5 members of the Tammany Society in a parlor, and ferociously expressed his determination to wage war upon the society as long as he lived, until, this reservation was added, quote, it opened its doors, unquote. Each hall, as a matter of political business, made the most virtuous and the strongest claims of being the true democratic organization. Each execrated the other and announced itself as the sole, valiant, sincere upholder of democracy. Wood's enemies made haste to guarantee their ascendancy when, on December 28th, the sachems ordered elections for the committees to be held on December 30th, thus giving but 1 day's notice of the event. Moreover, they forced upon all persons accepting membership in the committees a pledge that, in case of their election, they would support the Tammany organization and all nominations made under its authority, and disclaim allegiance to any other organization, party, or clique. The election of delegates to the various nominating conventions in the fall of 1858 was attended by the customary disorder. Wood's partisans were everywhere inciting trouble. At O'Connell's Hall on Mulberry Street, a crowd, seeing that the result was unfavorable to their side, split the ballot boxes and threw them into the street. The dead rabbits, scenting trouble, appeared hastily, and a fight ensued on Hester Street, in which 2 of them were shot. This municipal election was the first in which the Democratic voters of Irish nativity or lineage insisted on a full share of the best places on the party's ticket. Previously, they had seldom been allowed any local office above coroner. Their dominance on the Tammany ticket again roused the know-nothing sentiment, and a combination of Native Americans, Republicans, and Independents resulted. The combination secured 16 of the 24 councilmen. The politicians were now confronted with a Registry Act which omitted the blunder of that of 1840 in applying only to New York City. This measure became a law in 1859, despite the stubborn opposition of Tammany, some of whose leaders, Isaac Fowler and others, issued an address asking Democrats to arise and defeat it. Failing to defeat it, they resolved to circumvent it by means of the Board of Supervisors, which was required to appoint the registry clerks. This body was by law divided equally as to politics, the legislature calculating that this would ensure fair dealing. But by the purchase of the vote of one of the Republican supervisors for $2,500, the Tammany members were enabled not only to redistrict the city to their own advantage, but to appoint trusted tools as registrars. For appearance's sake, they allowed a Republican registry clerk here and there. Of 609 registrars appointed, the Republicans secured about 75. And of the whole 609, 68 were liquor sellers, 92 were petty office holders, 84 were supposed gamblers, and 50 of the names were not in the city directory. The Tammany leaders held daily private caucuses and made a list of henchmen with extreme care in order to exclude Wood from any influence with the registry clerks. William M. Tweed, a member of the board, generally named the men, and Elijah F. Purdy boasted that Tammany demanded the appointment of none but Democrats, and that the Tammany supervisors meant to sustain their party at any and all hazards. Having the registry clerks, Tammany Hall could revel in false registry and repeating. Good citizens, dejected at the outlook, were sure of a repetition of the frauds of former years. Seeking to satisfy all parties, Mayor Timon failed to satisfy any. He was accused of using the official patronage for the advantage of Tammany Hall in the hope of getting a renomination from it in 1859. He and his chief office holders appointed to the office the most notorious fighting men and ruffians in the city. The Tammany leaders did not favor him, possibly because they thought William F. Havemeyer a man of more weight and popularity and respectability. Accordingly, they nominated the latter. Wood had himself nominated by Mozart Hall, and the Republicans chose George P. Opdyke, a millionaire. In this triangular contest, the Tammany men felt that the force of Havemeyer's good record would put them in power. Singularly, however, with all its manipulation of the registry lists and the excellent character of its nominee, Tammany lost. The Irish voters sided almost solidly with Wood, and the lowest classes of the city, fearing the election of a man so distasteful to them as Havemeyer or Opdyke, used all their effectiveness for Wood, who received 29,940 votes against 26,913 for Havemeyer and 21,417 for Opdyke. It was conceded that much of the worst part of Tammany's strength had gone over to Wood. This fact was suggestive to a degree of Wood's assurance, considering the declaration in his letter of acceptance of the nomination that he favored, quote, excluding the bullies and rowdies from public employment and of dealing summarily with that class of outlaws, unquote. Although Tammany had nominated a good man for the sake of sliding into power upon the strength of his reputation, its lesser candidates were generally incompetent or of bad character. Half a dozen of its nominees for councilmen were under indictment for various crimes. Chapter 22. The Civil War and After, 1859 to 1867. The stirring years of the Civil War were drawing near. In this crisis, Tammany, ever pro-slavery, dealt in no equivocal phrases. On November 1st, 1859, at a meeting called to order by Isaac Fowler, James T. Brady, acting as president, referred to John Brown's raid as, quote, riot, treason, and murder, unquote. Brady and others spoke dolefully of the dire consequences of a continuation of the abolition agitation, and prophesied that if the, quote, irrepressible conflict, unquote, ever came, it would result in an extermination of the black race. But Grand Sachem Fowler was not to officiate at any more meetings. He had been living for several years at a rate far above his means. In one year, his bill at the New York Hotel, which he made the Democratic headquarters, amounted to $25,000. He had spent $50,000 toward the election of Buchanan. A social favorite, he gave frequent and lavish entertainments. President Pierce had appointed him postmaster, but the salary was only $2,500 a year, and he had long ago exhausted his private means and much of the property of his family. It was therefore a source of wonder whence his money came. The problem was cleared up when, on May 10th, 1860, he was removed from office, and an order was issued for his arrest under the accusation of having embezzled $155,000. The filching, it appeared, had been going on since 1855. Isaiah Reinders, then United States Marshal at New York, upon receiving orders to arrest Fowler, went to his hotel, but tarried at the bar, and by his loud announcement of his errand, allowed word to be taken to Fowler, who forthwith escaped. He subsequently made his way to Mexico. Sounds like Bob Chapman, huh? His brother, John Walker Fowler, who, upon recommendation of the quote-unquote 7 sachems, had been appointed clerk to surrogate Gideon J. Tucker, subsequently absconded with $31,079.65 belonging to orphans and others. In 1860, Tammany was greatly instrumental in inducing the Democrats of New York State to agree upon a fusion Douglas-Bell-Breckinridge electoral ticket. On the registration and election days, the frauds practiced against the Lincoln electors surpassed anything the city had known. In the 3rd Ward, 63 fictitious names were registered in a single election district. 500 of the 3,500 names of the 12th Ward Register were found to be, you guessed it, fraudulent. In the 17th Ward, 935 names on the registry books were spurious, no persons representing them being discoverable at the places given as their residences. An Irish widow's 2 boys, 6 and 7 years old, respectively, were registered, mother and sons, of course, knowing nothing of it, and so on ad libitum. Fictitious names accredited to vacant lots or uninhabited buildings were voted by the thousands. The announcement of the result gave the fusionists 62,600 votes and Lincoln 88,311. Looks to me like Lincoln won then. I wonder if he meant 162,000 for the fusionists. We'll read on and see. It says 62,000. All right. At the outbreak of the war, Mozart Hall, for purposes of political display, took a prompt position in favor of maintaining the Union, although Wood, its master spirit, advocated in a public message the detaching of New York City from the Union and transforming it into a free city on the Hamburg Plan. Tammany, perforce, had to follow the lead of Mozart Hall in parading its loyalist sentiments. The society raised a regiment which was taken to the field in June 1861 by Grand Sachem William D. Kennedy. Tammany long dwelt upon this action as a crowning proof of its patriotism. The real sentiments of the bulk of Tammany and of Mozart Hall were to the contrary. Both did their best to paralyze the energies of Lincoln's administration. In a speech to his Mozart Hall followers at the Volksgarten, November 27, 1861, Wood charged the national administration with having provoked the war and said that they, the administration, meant to prolong it while there was $1 to be stolen from the national treasury or a drop of Southern blood to be shed. At the Tammany celebration of July 4, 1862, Grand Sachem Nelson J. Waterbury, though expressing loyalty to the Union, averred that it was the President's duty, quote, to set his foot firmly upon abolitionism and crush it to pieces, and then the soldiers would fight unembarrassed, and victory must soon sit upon the national banners, unquote. Declarations of this kind were generally received with enthusiasm in both halls. At times, however, under the sting of severe public criticism, Tammany Hall made haste to assert its fealty to the Union cause. In September 1861, Elijah F. Purdy, chairman of its General Committee, issued a statement that, quote, Tammany Hall had maintained an unswerving position upon this great question from the time the first gun fired to the present hour. It has been zealously devoted to the Union in favor of upholding it with the utmost resources of the nation, and opposed to any action calculated to embarrass the government or to prevent all loyal men from standing together in solid column for the country, unquote. Tammany put forth the claim that, quote, 3/4 of the volunteer soldiers enlisted in this city and at the seat of war are Democrats attached to Tammany Hall, unquote. And on October 3, 1861, resolved that with a deep sense of the peril in which the Union and the Constitution were involved by the reckless war being waged for their destruction by armed traitors, Tammany Hall held it to be the first and most sacred duty of every man who loved his country to support the government. The war, which so engaged and diverted the popular mind, served as a cover for the continued manipulation of primaries and conventions, and the consummation of huge schemes of public plunder. Wood himself pointed out that from 1850 to 1860, the expenses of the city government had increased from over $3,800,000 to $9,758,000. Yet his term of office from 1860 to 1862 was characterized by even worse corruption than had flourished so signally in his previous terms. After his installation in 1860, it was charged that he had sold the office of city inspector to Samuel Downs, a man of wealth, for $20,000. That Downs had paid $10,000 to certain confederates of Wood, and that he had afterward been cheated out of the office. Another charge, the facts of which were related in a presentment by the grand jury, accused Wood of robbing the taxpayers of $420,000. The Common Council had awarded a 5 years street cleaning contract to Andrew J. Hackley at $279,000 a year, notwithstanding the fact that one among other responsible persons had bid $84,000 a year less. Afraid to submit the contract to the ordeal of public opinion, which might give rise to injunctions, the Common Council sped it through both boards on the same night. Waiting in his office until nearly midnight for the express purpose of signing it, the mayor hastily affixed his signature the moment it reached him. Sounds like how they did Jesus in, huh? Working at midnight. The grand jury found that the sum of $40,000 in bribes had been raised and paid for the passage of the contract. It was asserted the equivalent Wood received for signing the bill was 1/4 the amount of the contract, or $69,750 a year, for 5 years, free of any other consideration than his signature. The other beneficiaries of the contract supplying all the money needed to protect the fraud. Spurred on by public opinion, the police, when the work was not done in compliance with the contract, had reported to the controller, who had refused to pay the monthly bills. Then the contractors reduced the pay of their laborers from $1.25 to 95 cents a day in order to make good their payments to Wood. Man, always taking it out on the poor. Humankind never changes since the time of the pharaohs. That's your America. That's your Egyptian America, with all the symbology also. The same symbology. Continuing. Hiram Ketchum, in November 1861, publicly accused Wood of promising two men, Woodruff and Hoffman, Mozart Hall nominations for judgeships, upon which they each paid $5,000 in checks to Wood's account for quote-unquote election expenses. Pocketing the money, Wood then made an agreement with Tammany to unite on two other men, Monell and Barber, for judges, on condition that Tammany should not unite with the Republicans against him in the December mayoralty election. S. B. Chittenden, a citizen of wealth and standing, charged in Cooper Institute, November 26, 1861, that the signature of the street cleaning commissioner necessary for certain documents could be bought for $2,500, and intimated that Wood was not dissociated from the procedure. Wood had spent an enormous amount in his political schemes. He himself admitted, according to the testimony of A. W. Craven, chief engineer of the Croton Aqueduct Department, before a committee of aldermen, quote, that his object in removing heads of departments was to get control of the departments so that he could put in those who would cooperate with him and also could pay off his obligations, unquote. It is possible to give only an outline of the quote-unquote jobs stealthily put through the Common Council. Newspaper criticism was, in a measure, silenced by appropriations of from $10,000 to $20,000 a year for quote-unquote advertising, though occasional exposures were made in spite of this. One of these related to the appropriation of $105,000 in July 1860 for a few days' entertainment of the Japanese embassy in New York. Of this sum, only a few $1,000s were used for the purpose, the rest being stolen. Never more than now was patriotism shown to be the last refuge of scoundrels. Taking advantage of the war excitement, the most audacious designs on the city treasury were executed under color of acts of the purest patriotism. At a special meeting of the Common Council, August 21st, 1861, called ostensibly to help the families of the poor volunteers, a measure providing for the appointment of 22 street opening commissioners was hurriedly passed, upon the motion of Alderman Terence Fairley, against whom several untried indictments were pending. Without entering into details, it can be said that this action represented a theft of $250,000, in that the commissioners were superfluous, and their offices were created merely to make more places for a hungry host of political workers. If the city was a richer prize than ever to the politicians, the legislature was no less desirable. Alien members of both branches of that body were under the complete domination of political managers. It was notorious that the Democratic and the Republican lobby lords exchanged the votes of their respective legislative vassals, so that it mattered little to either which political party had the ascendancy in the legislature. One celebrated lobbyist declared that it was cheaper to buy than to elect a legislature. The passage of 5 franchises by the legislature on April 17, 1860, over Governor Morgan's veto, cost the projectors upwards of $250,000 in money and stock. Apparently hostile, the leaders of Tammany and of Mozart Hall soon saw that it was to their mutual benefit to have a secret understanding as to the division of the spoils. While Mozart had supremacy for the moment, Tammany had superior advantages. It could point to a long record. Its organization was perfect. It had a perpetual home, and the thousands of its disappointed ward workers and voters who had transferred their allegiance to Mozart in the hope of better reward would certainly flow back in time. This changing about was an old feature of New York politics. A successful political party was always depleted by thousands of office-seekers who left its ranks because of being disappointed in their hopes. Most important of all, Tammany had dealt the decisive blow to Mozart Hall at the Charleston Convention in 1860 and at the Syracuse Convention in September 1861, when its delegation secured the recognition of quote-unquote regularity. Hence, Mozart Hall, to avoid losing the state offices, willingly bargained with Tammany, and in the fall of 1861 the two combined on nominees for the legislature. They could not agree on the mayoralty, Wood determining to stand for re-election, but true to their agreement not to ally themselves with the Republicans, the Tammany leaders nominated independently, selecting C. Godfrey Gunther. Once more a non-partisan movement sprang up to combat the forces of corruption. The People's Union, composed of Republicans and Democrats, succeeded, despite the usual frauds, in electing George P. Opdyke, a Republican, by less than 1,000 plurality, he receiving 25,380 votes, Gunther 24,767, and Wood 24,167. In violation of the law, returns in 10 districts were held back for evident purposes of manipulation. When the figures showed Opdyke's election, attempts were made to deprive him of his certificate on the pretense that the returns as published in the daily newspapers were inaccurate. After much counting by the Board of Aldermen, whose attempt at quote-unquote counting out Opdyke was frustrated by the vigilance of his friends, the latter was declared elected by 613 plurality. Newspaper accounts described a lively time, quite in keeping with a long line of precedents in Tammany Hall on election night. The crowd was in unpleasant humor because of Gunther's defeat. When Jimmy Nesbitt, a good-natured healer of the 6th Ward, was called upon to preside, he tried to evoke cheers for Gunther. Chafing at the lack of enthusiasm, he swore fiercely at his hearers. A shout was heard, quote, 3 cheers for Fernando Wood, unquote, whereupon the eminent chairman lost his equanimity and let fly a pitcher at the offender's head. He was on the point of heaving another missile, a large pewter pitcher, but a bystander caught his hand. Cries of, "Tammany is not dead yet," were heard, and then Chauncey Schaefer regaled the crowd with the information that he got his first meal, with liquor thrown in, at Tammany Hall 16 years before, and he would never desert her. Schaefer told the Tammanites how he had gone to the White House and advised the President to let out the job of putting down the rebellion to Tammany Hall. Cries broke forth of, "You're drunk, Schaefer! You're a disgrace to Tammany Hall!" After trying to sing "The Red, White, and Blue," Schaefer stumbled off the platform. Isaiah Reinders then arose, and after denouncing the leaders for not being there, assured his hearers that there were many respectable gentlemen present, and some damned fools. This edifying meeting ended by, quote, "the chairman jumping from the platform and chasing a woodman out of the room," unquote. Though no longer in office, Wood was still a powerful factor, since Mozart Hall, of which he was the head, could poll, or pretend to poll, 25,000 votes. Further overtures were made between him and the leaders of Tammany in 1862, with the result that an understanding was reached to divide the nominations equally. The partition was conducted amicably until the office of surrogate was reached. Besides this, there was an odd member of the assembly not accounted for. The leaders could not agree as to how these two offices should be disposed of, and on the evening of October 2nd, the General Committee met in the wigwam to discuss the profound problem. Crowds were gathered inside and outside the hall, in the lobby, barroom, and on the stairs. The excitement was such that a squad of police was sent to the scene to maintain peace. Their services were needed. Heated discussions had been going on all the evening. Richard B. Connolly had his party on hand, eager for the fray. Francis Boole mustered his retainers by the score, quote, "fine, strapping fellows with upturned sleeves and significant red shirts that told of former battles and hard-earned laurels," unquote. At 11 o'clock the fighting began. It had not progressed far, however, when the police charged, and wielding their clubs right and left, drove the combatants in disorder into the street. The committee was in session nearly all night, but a renewal of the scrimmage was not attempted. After much haggling, the factions finally agreed. Nominations brought such great sums that the severe contention of the leaders is easily explainable. A hint of the enormous sums wrung from this source was given by Judge Maynard when addressing a meeting of the quote-unquote representative democracy in Cooper Union on October 27, 1863. He stated that one man in Mozart Hall, doubtless referring to Fernando Wood, was the chief of all the quote-unquote strikers in New York City, and that this person made from $100,000 to $200,000 every year marketing offices. Nominations and appointments went to the highest bidders, and some of the leaders held as many as 13 different offices each. At the same meeting, W. R. Rankin stated that, quote, "the manner in which these two organizations, Tammany Hall and Mozart Hall, have packed their preliminary conventions and organizations has been of such a character as to bring the blush of shame to every man of principle in the party. No man, were he to poll 10,000 votes under those primary elections, could be admitted within the precincts of Tammany Hall unless he came with the endorsement of the election inspectors, who were under the influence of the 2 or 3 men who held the reins of power there." Unquote. The state and congressional elections in November showed the power of the combined halls. Seymour, for governor, carried the city by 31,309 plurality. Among the Democratic congressmen elected was Fernando Wood, who, evidently despairing of again filling the mayor's chair, had determined to employ his activities in another field. The city election for minor officers occurred in December, and the 2 halls again won. The apportionment of the offices, however, caused a number of clashes. One of the offices filled was that of Corporation Council, the nomination to which fell to the lot of Mozart Hall. Wood had promised it to John K. Hackett, subsequently recorder, but gave it to John Devlin, a sachem, supposed to be one of Wood's bitterest opponents. By way of smoothing Hackett's ire, Wood promised to have him appointed corporation attorney. This promise was also broken. Hackett went to Wood's house and was shown into his parlor. "Mr. Wood," said Hackett, as soon as the man who had been thrice mayor of the metropolis of America appeared, "I call to say to you personally that you are a scoundrel, a rascal, and a perjured villain." Wood threatened to put him out and rang the bell. As the servant was on the point of entering, Hackett drew a revolver from his pocket and went on. "If that man comes between us, I shall blow out his brains and cut off your ears. So you may as well listen. On a certain night, in a room of the Astor House, there were 4 persons, Mr. D, Mr. X, Mr. Y, and yourself. One of these 4 is a scoundrel, a rascal, a perjured villain, and a hound. It is not Mr. D, nor Mr. X, nor Mr. Y. Who he is, I leave you to imagine." The degraded state of politics, sinking yearly still lower, caused unspeakable disgust. But the honest element of the citizenship seemed powerless. The occasional election of a reform mayor made little difference in the situation, for either through the impotence of his position or his personal incompetency, the spoilsmen managed to prevail. The Common Council was the supreme power, and this body Tammany, or Tammany and Mozart together, generally controlled. The public money was spent as the aldermen pleased. The mayor's veto became a legal fiction, for a bare majority sufficed to overcome it, and this could generally be secured through deals and the trading of votes on one another's quote-unquote jobs. The veto, in the words of a later mayor, amounted, quote, "to nothing more than the publication of his remonstrance in corporation newspapers to cause a few hours' delay and excite the contempt of the members of the Common Council who have determined to carry their measure in spite of his remonstrance." Unquote. Public indignation resulted in another anti-Tammany demonstration of strength in 1868. The wigwam nominated for mayor Francis Boole, generally considered as nauseating a type of the politician as Tammany could bring forth. Independent Democrats and some Republicans thereupon rallied to the support of C. Godfrey Gunther, nominee of a new quote-unquote reform organization, the quote-unquote McKeon Democracy. The Republican organization, however, stood apart nominating Orison Blunt. Gunther was elected, receiving 29,121 votes to 22,579 for Boole and 19,383 for Blunt. At this, as in previous elections, there were unmistakable wigwam frauds, such as repeating and altering election returns. Hitherto, in presidential conventions since Van Buren's time, the Democratic candidates had been nominated against Tammany's resistance, the organization having had each time a candidate of its own whom it sought to force on the convention. In 1864, however, the wigwam shrewdly anticipated the action of the Chicago Convention by recommending McClellan as the Democratic nominee. On the night of McClellan's nomination, Tammany held a ratification meeting in the City Hall Park, denounced, quote, the imbecility of the administration of Abraham Lincoln, unquote, in the conduct of the war, and, quote, its ruinous financial policy, unquote, and declared that it had, quote, forfeited the confidence of the loyal states, usurped powers not granted by the Constitution, endeavored to render the executive, aided by the military, superior to the judicial and legislative branches of the government, and assume to destroy life and confiscate property by its unconstitutional proclamations, unquote. Again, on November 16th, at a meeting of the General Committee, George H. Purser, a lobbyist and organization leader, offered a resolution which was unanimously approved, practically declaring the war a failure. There is little to say of Hoffman's administration. Frauds and thefts of every description continued as before, though it is not possible to connect his name with any of them. His popularity grew. The Tammany Society elected him Grand Sachem. The Democratic State Committee named him for governor in 1866, and toward the end of his term as mayor, he was renominated for that office. Fernando Wood again came forth as the Mozart Hall nominee, and the Republicans selected William Darling. Hoffman swept everything before him in December of 1867, receiving 63,061 votes to 22,837 for Wood and 18,483 for Darling. The total vote was 104,481, an increase of 22,779 in 2 years. The reasons for this astounding augmentation were no secret to anyone. Repeating was one cause, and false registration was another. In one ward alone, the 18th, in this election, 1,500 fraudulent registrations were discovered. But the main cause was illegal naturalization. In the Supreme Court and the Court of Common Pleas, citizens were turned out at the rate of often about 1,000 a day. Just like the Latinos today in the Southwest, it was the Irish in the 1800s, all pushed here from the same New World Order sitting atop entity. Just like the American inventor Samuel Morse was warning about way back in the 1830s. The state census of 1865 gave the city 51,500 native and 77,475 naturalized voters. The figures were doubtless false, probably having been swelled to allow fraudulent totals at the polls to come within the limits of an officially declared total of eligible voters. Nevertheless, the figures are significant of the proportion of aliens to natives. The predominance of the former, moreover, was daily made greater through the connivance of corrupt judges with the frauds of the politicians. The bulk of these aliens added to the hopelessness of the situation. With their European ideas and training, and their ignorance of our political problems, they became the easy prey of the ward bosses and aided in imposing upon the city a reign of unexampled corruption. Heretofore, the Tammany organization had been held in the control of constantly changing combinations. Duumvirates, triumvirates, and cliques of various numbers of men had risen, prospered, and passed away. The period is now reached when the power became centralized in one man. Fernando Wood had illustrated the feasibility of the boss system. William M. Tweed now appeared to develop it to its highest pitch. The boss was the natural result of the recognized political methods, where, as in previous times, 3 or 4 or half a dozen leaders had put their wits together and dictated and sold nominations, Tweed, astute, unprincipled, and thoroughly versed in the most subterranean phases of ward politics, now gathered this power exclusively in his own hands. How he and his followers used it was disclosed in the operations of the extraordinary Tweed or Tammany ring. I can't wait to get to the next chapter, because I read a mainstream historian's whitewashed version of the history about Boss Tweed a couple of years ago. And I knew it was whitewashed because John Jacob Astor was portrayed in the background as kind of reminding Boss Tweed, stop what you're doing, you can't engage in fraud like this, in criminality. Yeah, right, the bankers are really like that, right. When you consider Gus Myers wrote what a murderous businessman John Jacob Astor was. He was public enemy number 1 when it came to genociding the Indians, feeding them liquor, ripping them off, destroying them. Okay, so yeah, I can't wait. I'm going to guess that the bankers don't get a whitewash job in Gus Myers' version, the real history about Boss Tweed. Okay, folks, you've been listening to another installment of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers, and this has been Rejected Knowledge.